Somehow, the usual Big 12 juggernaut, that is Kansas, found themselves in 5th place last season. Surely that won't happen again, right?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. I'm your host, Isaac Shea, joined, of course, by my good buddy, Andy Patton. We are your co-hosts of this show, and you're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. And we want to thank you for making us your first listener watch and remind you that you can catch every episode ad-free at Amazon Music. Big time special shout out to all the everydayers joining us, and of course, the Locked On College Basketball Discord members. We're so glad you're all here. Let's get into it. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Andy, it's hard to believe that we are here, but this is the last conference preview of the offseason. We're hitting the Big 12 today. Folks, if you'd like to check out other conference previews, we got a playlist of those going for you, as well as all our team previews that we've been doing. I think we might have a couple more next week, but next week on Friday's show, it's bold predictions time, baby, where we are sure to be dead wrong as always. Andy, coming up on the show today, we're going to have our Big 12 tiers. We'll talk about NCAA tournament teams, all Big 12, superlatives, all that. But first, we're going to get into our biggest storylines. Let me remind you, folks, of what happened last year. As the Big 12 does for now the 3 straight years in a row, finished number 1 at KenPom. Regular season champ was Houston by 2 games over Iowa State, who then proceeded to dominate everyone in the Big 12 tournament. Iowa State, that is, not Houston. In the postseason, 8 teams made it in. Houston, Iowa State to the Sweet 16. We all think Houston makes it further with the healthy Jamal Shead. Baylor, Kansas, and Texas made it to the second round. BYU, TCU, and Texas Tech, they made it. And then 3 teams in the NIT, Cincy to the quarterfinal, K-State and UCF made it as well. Andy, we've got multiple conference changes, and in this one, both in and out, as well as a couple new coaches in the league. Why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, lots of different changes here in the Big 12. Obviously, the big move was Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12, going to the SEC, the move that was kind of the catalyst for almost everything that we've seen change-wise in college athletics in the last couple of years with regards to the Pac-12 and the WCC in the Mountain West, and going all the way down to the WAC and other small conferences impacted by this decision for Texas and Oklahoma to join the SEC. They're out the door for the first time this year. Meanwhile, after adding 4 schools last year to the Big 12, Brett Yormark did it again. 4 more schools coming in, the corner schools from the Pac-12. That's Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado, who's coming back to the Big 12 after leaving initially in the 2010-2011 season. So clearly this is a move where Arizona is going to be a big needle mover in the Big 12, a top 10 team in the preseason, yet barely a top 5 team in the Big 12 because of how top-heavy this conference is expected to be. The other 3 teams, not as much, mostly going to be probably towards the bottom, at least early on. We'll see if those programs can kind of start to make some moves, make some headway in the men's basketball side of things. But right now, probably not going to be super big players early on. And then coaching changes, 3 different changes in the conference, the most notable one being Kevin Young, coming over from being an assistant coach of the Phoenix Suns to take over the BYU Cougars. Of course, Mark Pope left BYU to go coach at his alma mater, Kentucky. That's been a massive storyline throughout the offseason. It will be a storyline into the season. It already is. Kentucky beat the absolute doors off of a team they played in the scrimmage a couple of days ago. I think they won by 71 points. I don't care who you're playing. That is ridiculous. But for Kevin Young, this is a coach coming in who doesn't have D1 college basketball coaching experience, or at least not head coaching experience, yet he has already landed some of the highest profile recruits in program history. There's a lot of real buzz around this team, so it's going to be very fascinating to follow how he does to start his college career. You also have Steve Lutz taking over at Oklahoma State. Spent 1 year at Western Kentucky, 2 years at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, replacing Mike Boynton, who was with the Cowboys for 7 years. And then Darian DeVries coming over from Drake to coach at West Virginia, replacing Josh Ehlert, who was the interim coach last year, replacing Bob Huggins. Things didn't go very well for West Virginia last year, 9-23, but there was a ton of players who left that program in the middle of the summer. It was a really tough situation for Coach Ehlert. Now DeVries comes in. He brings his son, 20-point-per-game scorer, Tucker DeVries, over from Drake. It's going to be very fun to see how Tucker adjusts to being in the Big 12. Those are kind of the main storylines, I think, just in terms of personnel changes, coaching changes, and then team changes in the Big 12. But really enough changes that I think is going to make this a really fascinating season outside of just talking about the top 5 teams, which is already in itself going to be super interesting as well.
Yeah, Andy, and then we get into the Kansas of it all as I teased in the cold open there. Kansas finished last year 5th, tied for 5th, at least in the Big 12 standings, Andy, which we just do not see happen. That is not Kansas. That's not Bill Self, but it happened. In fact, Andy, we thought about it right before we went on recording, and we went and researched it. So Kansas last year won neither the Big 12 regular season or the Big 12 tournament. And we thought about, I know they're very highly ranked this year, but like, what if something happens and once again, they don't win the regular season or Big 12 tournament? And we thought, how many times has that ever happened when Kansas won neither in back-to-back seasons? Well, Andy, we went and researched it. The Big 12 has existed since the 96-97 season, and that has happened just one time, 99-2000 and 2000-2001. Kansas won neither the regular season nor the conference tournament. And so while we expect Kansas to be infinitely better, this is a loaded conference in which they very well could not, and it would just be the second time ever for Kansas.
Yeah, and the funny thing is 3 of those 4 teams that defeated Kansas in those 2 years were Iowa State programs. And I think the other one was Oklahoma winning the conference tournament, I think in the 2001 season. But
right.
If it's not going to happen this year for Kansas, if this is going to happen for the second time ever, where Kansas doesn't win back-to-back, doesn't win either the regular season or the conference tournament in back-to-back years, there's a pretty good chance Iowa State's going to have something to do with that. Once again, this program is in really good shape right now under Coach TJ Otzelberger. They just dominated the conference tournament last year. They obviously finished behind Houston in the regular season standings, but then they get into the Big 12 tournament, beat Kansas State by 17, beat Baylor by 14, beat Houston by 28. Just extraordinary run from this program. And they got pretty much everybody back from last year's team. Taman Lipsey is back. Curtis Jones is back. Keshawn Gilbert is back. Milan Momcilovic is back. They add some key pieces in the front court. Deshaun Jackson, Brandon Chatfield. They add Joshua Jefferson from St. Mary's. Like, this is a very, very good team coming into a year where they had a lot of momentum at the end of last season. Look, Kansas is great. And Kansas is the top ranked team in most of the preseason polls for a reason. They should be, but between Iowa State, who looks fantastic coming into the year, and Houston, who's not going to lay down easy, this is not going to be an easy path for Kansas. Arguably one of the toughest paths they're ever going to face to try to get back to being the regular season and or conference tournament champion.
And I think part of that, Andy, is because last year at KenPom, for example, Houston and Iowa State were number 1 and 2 in defensive efficiency at KenPom. I think I said that in reverse order. Yeah, Iowa State won, Houston 2, and KenPom has them predicted yet again as the top 2 teams' defensive efficiency nationally. And that, we always talk about defense travels, and so that's clearly something to keep an eye on. Andy, we kind of talked about the streakiness of Kansas itself, which has been the flagship of the Big 12. Let's talk about the Big 12 itself, which has been the number 1 rated conference at KenPom for 3 straight seasons. Are they going to make it to a 4th, or will somebody, I think namely the SEC, who right now is rated preseason number 1 at KenPom, jump up and snatch that title away from them?
It's going to be really interesting to see. I think it's probably going to be the Big 12 because they are so top heavy. I mean, 5 teams in the top 10 of the AP poll, 5 teams in the top 10 of the coaches poll for USA Today. And I think KenPom has, I don't think they have 5 in the top 10, but they have 5 in the top 15. I'm pretty sure from the Big 12. Like, this conference is so top heavy, but the SEC is deeper. The SEC is deeper 1 through 10, I think, than the Big 12, and it's close. But then the problem too for the Big 12 is that we kind of alluded to this early on. Like, they add Arizona, which absolutely helps the top end of the conference, but they also add Colorado and Utah and Arizona State. And I think that those teams are going to drag them down a little bit. Whereas if those teams that are kind of in that 9 to 12 range in the SEC, those South Carolinas and Mississippi States and teams like that. Like if those teams are better than the TCU and Colorado and Utahs of the world in the Big 12, I could see that being a difference maker, especially if Alabama and Auburn finish like right up in the top 5, along with where we're expecting teams like Houston and Iowa State and Kansas to finish. I think it's going to be very close. I think it is definitely between those two teams. Those two conferences. The Big East has bottom feeders that are going to drag them down, even though they only have 11 teams. The ACC is not at that level right now. The Big Ten is not at that level right now, just because they also have teams that are going to drag them down a little bit. So to me, it's between the Big 12 and the SEC. I think they're going to be 1 and 2 unquestionably, but I think realistically, it feels like it could go either way.
And, like a difference from last year, for example, is both Houston and BYU, newcomers last year, finished top 20 at KenPom. And so like last year, I remember us having a conversation like, with the newcomers, will Big 12 stay atop things? And I think those teams were all more, or not all of them, but some of those teams were more highly rated. So that is certainly a thing to be watching out for this year. Going to be a fun race to track.
Well, Isaac, we're going to talk about how difficult it is to pick a transfer of the year in this conference, because there are so many incredibly talented transfers. We're going to move that to the next section here, where we're going to make our predictions. We're going to make our predictions for who we have on the all Big 12 team, who is going to be our transfer of the year pick, and who is going to be some of those honorable mentions. We'll also talk freshman of the year, coach of the year, defensive player of the year, all those superlatives coming up here in just a second. Let's talk about Prize Picks, the place that has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you have to do is pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. Love how simple this concept is. It takes away any concern over complicated fantasy strategies. I also really appreciate that Prize Picks has an injury insurance policy. Nothing's worse than picking someone and they go down in the second play of the game, and I'm just always nervous that that's going to happen to me. And with Prize Picks, your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets hurt. I also like checking in on their weekly promotions, like Taco Tuesday, when Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide you with even more value. So folks, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's code LOCKEDONCollege on the Prize Picks app to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. All right, Isaac, moving on to talk about our predictions for the Big 12. We're going to talk first team projections as well as player of the year, transfer of the year. Like we said, that is a difficult race this season. We'll also talk freshman of the year, defensive player of the year, and coach of the year. Isaac, I'll have you give your 5-player all Big 12 first team, with the caveat that we've had for all of these conference previews that we only pick 1 player per team. So we're not going to pick 2 players on the same team. Honestly, I don't think that would have been a problem this year. There are multiple teams who have multiple talented players, but there's also just so many different number 1 options on all these teams that it was difficult to narrow it down, even with that caveat in place. Isaac, who do you have on your 5-player first team for the Big 12?
Andy, this felt like an exercise in futility, just because it's so insanely difficult to narrow this down to 5. But I love that we won't allow ourselves to bloat on that. I'm going to go Hunter Dickinson from Kansas. I think he'll be a lot of people's picks for preseason player of the year in the Big 12. Andy, I don't love it when I pick it, but I think it makes sense, right? Only player in the Big 12 to average a double-double last year. I feel like it is a natural choice, but I'm curious to see how this team evolves around him. But that LJ Cryer, I think, is going to be Houston's best player this year. And so best player on what I think will be a top 2, top 3 team in the conference for me is Cryer. And then kind of the same reasoning with Taman Lipsey. Definitely going to go with him as, for me, the best player for Iowa State, best 2-way player, which is obviously important for TJ Otzelberger and what they're doing. Those 3 for me, Andy, kind of stood out, if I'm being honest, and I really struggled with my others. I'm not going to mention the other people I picked out or didn't pick out, because I think you might have some of them in yours. But one of them was Norchad Omier, who's coming over from Miami. Talking about Hunter Dickinson and his double-doubles, Norchad Omier is going to make it to where there are 2 players in the Big 12 who average a double-double this season, because that's what he is, a double-double machine. The past 2 seasons in the ACC, only he and Armando Bacot from North Carolina have done that. I think he's going to be stellar for these Baylor Bears. And then the other one for me, and this is kind of my maybe out of right field, is JT Toppin at Texas Tech. Andy, I think we both feel this way about him, but was just an absolute dude as a freshman at New Mexico last year. And I think that trend continues as he goes to Lubbock. And I just think he's going to have a blow up sophomore year and be on the national radar a little bit more because he's in the Big 12.
Yeah, I had 3 of the same 5, and it's the 3 that I think most people are going to expect. Hunter Dickinson, again, double-double in the Big 12, very well-known figure, back for his 5th year on the team that most are projecting at the top. Like that, he just feels like the right pick there from that program. I also have LJ Cryer and Taman Lipsey for basically the exact same reasons you laid out. They're both versatile two-way players. They're the best players on their teams. Their teams are both projected to be top 5 at worst, top 10 teams in the country, and top 3 teams in the Big 12. So it feels like they're just as obvious of picks as you can have in a conference that is as loaded as the Big 12. We differ on the final 2, and I considered Toppin. I end up having him somewhere else here on these superlatives, and I very close to Omier. I actually typed him and deleted him and typed him again and couldn't decide whether I wanted Norchad Omier here or not. Did not go with him, but I did go with Caleb Love at Arizona. I think he's going to be a popular pick here. A lot of people have him picked as an All-American, at least on one of those 3 teams. He's going to score a lot of points. We know that he does that. He is capable of scoring enough points to win a game for Arizona. He's also capable of shooting himself out of a game for Arizona. We've seen that in the past. We saw it at North Carolina. We saw it at Arizona last year. But this team is if they're going to be a top 5 team in this conference and a potential top 10 team nationally, if they finish the season in that conversation, it would be very surprising to me if Caleb Love wasn't here. And then my last pick, this is one I waffled on quite a bit between him and Omier and a couple others, but I ended up going with Doug McDaniel at Kansas State. Maybe a bit out of left field for that one, but this is a guy who averaged 16 points a game at Michigan last year on a team that was dysfunctional and struggled and was in a solid conference in the Big Ten. And I think we have seen what Jerome Tang can do with these smaller, high energy guards. We've seen it with Marquise Noel. We've seen it with Tyler Perry. Like, we've seen him do this. And Doug McDaniel just feels tailor-made for Jerome Tang's system, and with a lot of talent around him, with Brendan Housen coming in to space the floor, with some of the front court additions they've made with Onyenso and Achor and Coleman Hawkins. It may take some time for all of these pieces to come together for Jerome Tang's team, and I think that's a legitimate reason to be skeptical. But if things kind of go the way we think that they're capable of going, I could see Doug McDaniel in this conversation unquestionably.
Yeah, Andy, in the same way you talked about struggling with putting Norchad Omier in and out, I did the same thing with Caleb Love. I think it was that inconsistency you mentioned that ultimately led me to pulling him out. But I'm very hopeful for a more consistent 5th year. And if so, he would absolutely be on the list. Andy, player of the year, who did you go with?
I didn't go with Dickinson here. I think part of it is the two-way capability. There's other players in this conference who I think are going to be similarly impactful offensively, who are more impactful defensively. And that was the main reason that I went with LJ Cryer instead. Cryer is a guy who is a dynamic scorer. He's going to be the lead player for Houston. And we've seen Houston guards who are kind of take over that lead role be incredibly successful the last few years, with Marcus Sasser and then Jamal Shedd last year. I think LJ Cryer is going to kind of take that mantle on. He's not as much of a pure point guard as those guys were, but he's a great defender. He's a great shooter. And I think he's going to be the leader of arguably the best team in the Big 12, at least right in that conversation with Kansas and Iowa State. And so I think LJ Cryer is going to be the guy.
Wow. What's funny, Andy, is that's exactly who I went with for all the same reasons. I'll not say another word about it, so we can move on to transfer of the year, which, Andy, I don't know how you feel. All the conference previews we've done, all the superlatives we've done, narrowing this down to one player from a conference that is absolutely loaded with incredible transfers who are also going to have big time opportunity on their team, which is a critical part of this. This was the single hardest superlative I've had this whole offseason. How about you feel similarly?
I do. Yeah. And for me, I only have one transfer on my first team, and that's Doug McDaniel. So that's who I went with. But you have two in O'Meara and Toppin, who I think are both incredibly strong candidates. And even other guys we haven't mentioned yet. Tucker DeVries, we talked about him very briefly, but he's somebody who could put up numbers for that West Virginia team and be in this conversation without a doubt. I mean, there's many others who I think will be. Jeremy Roach for Baylor could be in this conversation. AJ Storr from Kansas, or Zeke Mayo even. Like, there are so many players who I think will contend to be one of, if not the very best transfer in this conference. I'm going with McDaniel because he was my first team pick, but there are a lot of different players who fit this bill.
Yeah, let me just throw another couple names. Rylan Griffin, Trey Townsend, Coleman Hawkins. Good grief, we haven't said his. I mean, I know you mentioned him in Kansas State front, but it's just on and on and on we can go. I know we're leaving names out, but it's just an embarrassment of transfer riches, and that makes me really happy. Andy, freshman of the year. While the transfer of the year was difficult for me, this one for me was easy. What about you?
Yeah, it was easy for me too. It's VJ Edgecombe. Just seems like such a polished player for his age. Scott Drew does wonderful things with young players. We've seen that in the past. They've had quite a handful of players be one and done just in the last couple of years coming out of that program. Edgecombe feels like he's in a perfect spot with some veteran leadership around him, like Jeremy Roach, like Norchad O'Meara. He's going to have a green light opportunity to get downhill, to get to the rim, to score. He's just such a dynamic talent. There's a lot of good freshmen in this conference. It's not he's the best of a mediocre group. There's some really talented ones, but Edgecombe just feels like the pretty clear and obvious choice for me.
Yep, same for me too. And I think that opportunity you just talked about is important. That's why, for example, we might not go with somebody like Flory Badunga at Kansas or Keith Passmore at Kansas, who are going to be great, but Kansas just doesn't need them as much as Baylor.
Carter Bryant at Arizona is
yes. Love that. My honorable mention, though, just to get another name, is Jaden Quaintance at Arizona State, which is still such a surprising pull for Bobby Hurley for me. But I think, again, opportunity, I think he's going to have lots of it there. Andy, two more very quickly. Defensive player of the year for the Big 12.
I'm going JT Toppin. I said I was going to talk about him later, so this is where he comes up. Just under 2 blocks per game last year at New Mexico. A phenomenal rebounder, did most of his damage on the defensive glass. I think Grant McCaslin is a phenomenal defensive coach, and I think getting Toppin into that system, familiar with what they do, I think he's going to put up really big numbers. Once again, I think there's a lot of really good candidates in this conference, and a lot of guys who are returning. So picking a transfer may be a bit risky in that regard, but I just think Toppin is such a versatile defensive player, and I think he's going to show that out in McCaslin's system.
Last year, as a reminder of just how much Houston was missing after he went down, Jamal Shedd was the defensive player of the year in the Big 12 to go with everything he did offensively. But Andy, the only other player that was a unanimous selection to the All-12 defensive team last year was Iowa State's Taman Lipsey. I'm going with him for my player of the year. As we transition to coach of the year, Andy, I'm going to go with Cincinnati's Wes Miller. The Bearcats were 11th in the conference last year when it had fewer teams, by the way. And I know, because they're being picked higher this year, maybe people aren't like, well, so what? They're expected to be a little better. But yeah, coming from 11th in the Big 12 to jump it, like, especially if they get top 5, no doubter for me. But even if they finish 6th or 7th in the Big 12, I think he would be an obvious pick. With I struggled between he and TJ Otzelberger. Like, if Iowa State can be this year what they were again, then I think you got to give it to him, because he didn't win it last year. It was Kelvin Sampson.
Yeah. I'm going with Kevin Young from BYU, new coach, obviously, into the conference, new coach at this level. But I really like this BYU team. They have a ton of talent, some young guys coming in. I didn't get a chance to mention my honorable mention for freshman of the year. It's Igor Demin, a Russian guard coming over from Russia to BYU. A lot of people have him as a projected one-and-done caliber player. I think he's going to be great in that system. I think this BYU team is going to finish in that 6-7 range, 6-7-8 range. That's kind of similar to where they were last year, so I'm not sure if he'll get a lot of love for that, but it's, he's not Mark Pope, and so I'm curious if he'll get some attention for being the coach of the year, for being a new coach at a program like BYU and leading them to success in this conference. I mean, that's really hard to do, and I think if they finish in that range, he will be and should be considered for that award.
And I think there's going to be more national attention on BYU this year just because of the AJ DeBanza watch that we're all on and that whole thing. All right, Andy, it seems to us like there's a pretty clear top 5 teams in tier 1 of the Big 12. But is there somebody that could jump up and surprise us? Or maybe one of those 5 teams kind of drops off. Man, it's always fun to think about and talk about, and we're going to do exactly that in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. So maybe you're just watching a game. You're like, oh, wow, DeAndre Hopkins is a Chief. When did that happen? Well, this week it happened. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can go check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Andy, we're talking Big 12. How about some regular season champion odds? I think this is the tightest race that we've seen in any of these conference odds. Right now, Kansas leads the way at plus 220. Followed very tightly on their heels is Houston at plus 230, Iowa State at plus 470, Baylor at 800, and Arizona at 850. So why don't you go check out those Big 12 odds, other conferences as well. They're adding more and more, Andy. That list is growing and beyond even the top 5. So there's lots of good mid-major stuff as well. If you want to go check that out or anything else, go do it all at FanDuel.com. It's America's #1 sportsbook. All right, let's talk about our Big 12 tiers brought forth to us today by Mr. Andrew Stephen Patton. I know that's not your middle name, but it just sounded good in the moment. And then we'll also give you our picks for conference champ, conference tournament champ, and number of teams in the Big Dance. Andy, what's really stands out, I think, is most of this offseason, we've looked at what we think on paper, of course, is a pretty clear-cut top 5 of Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, Baylor, and Arizona. I continue to feel that way, and I love how the Big 12 schedulers did it to where it's pretty balanced between how many of those schools are playing each other multiple times, so really well done there. As you look at that top 5, though, Andy, if I forced you to pick one of those that would not be in the top 5 when it's all said and done in March, who would you pick?
I'd pick Arizona, and it's mostly because, I mean, for a couple of factors. They're newer to the conference, and so I think just the idea of them dropping 1 or 2 games in conference play simply because they're not familiar with the travel, they're not familiar with the road environment that they're going into. I mean, frankly, they're adjusting to Big 12 officiating. Like, there are just differences when you switch to a new conference. And while I don't really think Arizona is below, I mean, I think all these teams are really close to each other. I do think Arizona is the quote unquote worst of the bunch, but they're all really, really good. I just think that Arizona is, we'll see what they look like. They got some new pieces. They're replacing a handful of starters. And I think this slight difference in being unfamiliar with the conference is enough that I could see them dropping 1 or 2 games that they wouldn't normally drop. And that's maybe enough for somebody like Texas Tech or Kansas State or somebody else to sneak in and knock them off being in the top 5.
Yeah, I'm with you. Kansas, Houston, and Iowa State, as we talked about with our first team selections earlier, feel like pretty much locks. And so for me, it would be between Baylor and Arizona. But with the proven commodities that are Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, the talent of VJ Edgecombe, which those guys are going to be able to help bring along, I feel a little bit more confident in Baylor's consistency than I do the Arizona consistency, especially given what you said earlier about Caleb Love. We think Trey Townsend's going to come in from Oakland and be a dude again, but he is coming up, and that's a big deal. So I would actually pick Arizona as well. Andy, I know usually I try to nitpick apart your tiers here, but I also agree with your tier 2, which includes Texas Tech, Kansas State, Cincinnati, and BYU. Andy, what I'm really curious to see, and we had this kind of in our storylines to talk about, Kansas State has this pretty loaded front court of Coleman Hawkins, Achor, and Ugonna Onyenso, who all transfer in from Illinois, Samford, and Kentucky, respectively. I think it was John Rothstein's Big 12 breakdown where he had all 3 of those guys starting. I think it was Hawkins 3, Achor 4, and Onyenso 5. Do you see Jerome Tang doing that? Would it work, I guess? I do think he might do that. I don't know if I agree with it, but he's the one. He's the one at practice. He's the one watching these guys. He's got more familiarity with what they want to do with that lineup. And look, if they start this lineup, or even if they play it consistently throughout the season, it's going to create problems for the other team. There may be some deficiencies that they have, but it's going to be other teams are going to have to adjust to that. I'm trying to think of good examples. Like Baylor's a team that's not very big. And if Baylor, and I'm not sure what lineups look like for Baylor if they have to guard these 3 guys all on the floor at the same time.
like that's going to be an issue for them and for many other teams in the conference. I'm just picking on them, but like it's going to be interesting to see what they do, because you have that lineup, then you have Brennan Housen and Doug McDaniel, and it's like, okay, you got shooting, you got floor spacing, you have a ton of size. Defensively, I think is where the question mark is. If you trust that Onyenso can be enough of an eraser on the backcourt to kind of, or in the front court to kind of erase some of the mistakes that some of your bigs might be making trying to guard on the perimeter, like maybe you can go with it. I mean, I think of like the Chet Holmgren Gonzaga team where they let Drew Timme defend away from the rim because he's not very good at it. But if guys got around him, they had to get through Chet. And Onyenso is the kind of rim protector that can maybe help mitigate some of those issues for this team. But I'm skeptical of how well it works. It may limit their transition opportunities, other things like that. But I would love to see them try it. And if Jerome Tang's a very good coach, I give him the benefit of the doubt. If he thinks this is going to work, let's see it, because I think it could be really fun.
And you talked about the shooting, Andy. Let's remember that Hawkins and Achor are both good shooters last year. Smaller sample size for Achor, but he was 27 of 62. That's 43.5%. Coleman Hawkins, much bigger volume, 59 of 160, which is 36.9%. So they got shooting 1 through 4. I want to see it, man. I would just love to see it. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Anyway, Andy, let's get to your other 3 tiers, where what's funny is this is where I think it's more difficult in the Big 12, because these are the teams that you put in a hat, shake it up, and pull them out. Tier 3, you've got TCU, Colorado, and Arizona State. Tier 4, you've got West Virginia and UCF. Tier 5, Utah and Oklahoma State. I think here's my biggest quibble is I would have Colorado move from Tier 3 down to Tier 5. They just lost so much talent off to the NBA last year. And I think, unfortunately for Tad Boyle, I think it's just going to be a struggle of a year this year. So I would drop them to Tier 5. I think that's the biggest quibble I have with it.
Yeah, Colorado was a tough team to figure out. I think to me, Tier 1 and Tier 2 were easy. The top 9 pretty easy. TCU, I was telling you before we recorded, I almost put them on an island. I almost had them be a single team in a tier because they felt better than the rest of the group, but not quite on the level of those top 9 teams. Everybody 11 through 16, realistically, I think you could move around. I think I feel pretty comfortable with Utah and Oklahoma State being at the bottom here. But everybody else, like Central Florida, West Virginia, Arizona State, Colorado, I'm not super quibbly about where those teams are. I think all of them could realistically be on the higher end of that scale or even on the lower end of it. I think Tad Boyle is a very good coach, which was part of the reason I had them a little higher. But yeah, that's a team that lost a ton of talent from last year. And it might be a bit of a challenge to have a new look roster in a new conference, especially with the competition level being dramatically different from what it was in the Pac-12.
Andy, we started the show by talking about Kansas not winning the Big 12 regular season or tournament last year and how that has only happened back-to-back once ever at the turn of the century. Andy, let's make our regular season and conference tournament predictions. Is it going to happen again?
Yeah, I think people probably guessed that we are going to have it happen again because that's why we talked about it early in the show. I have Houston winning the regular season. They did it last year, and I think this team is, obviously losing Jamal Shead is brutal, but they have most of the rest of that team back. They got Francis back in the front court. They got Sharp back. They, of course, got LJ Cryer back. If Terrence Arsenault's healthy, that's a huge addition for them. So I got them winning the regular season. And give me Iowa State in the conference tournament. Again, it's what happened last year. Iowa State pounded everybody in that conference tournament. It's a roster that looks very similar from last year. I think Kansas is going to be much better than they were last year. I think they had one of the best off seasons in college basketball with the additions of Storr and Mayo and Griffin. But I like Houston and Iowa State's continuity a little bit better, and I think that they're going to be the 2 teams that win it here again.
Okay, Andy, what's interesting is I have Houston as well. In regular season, Kelvin Sampson just feels inevitable in Houston to me, which is crazy to say in a conference that has Bill Self in Kansas, but it just feels that way. Yeah. And then conference tournament champ, I love your Iowa State pick, and it makes a ton of sense. I'm actually going with Baylor. Part of that for me is the experience of Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, who are both Final Four participants at other schools, obviously, but there's something about how that translates to other tournament moments. That's a part of the year where VJ Edgecombe will be coming into his own, hopefully. I also hope, and it seems like Langston Love is going to be back to full health, and knock on wood for that. And you add in Jaden Nunn and what he's going to be able to do, and several guys coming off that's not even, for all I know, Josh Ojinawa is going to be started, right? So I feel like Baylor is going to come back and do it. That's who I've got. Andy, let's wrap the show. Number of teams from the Big 12 in the NCAA tournament. On our background here on YouTube, you prepared this, by the way, today, and you were 10 NCAA tournament teams? Question mark. So, Andy, answer your own question. Is it going to happen?
I don't think so. I got 9, and it's boring, but I got the top tier 1 and tier 2. Obviously, the top 5: Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, Baylor, Arizona. It'd be a stunner if any of those teams somehow failed to make the NCAA tournament. Texas Tech, Kansas State, Cincinnati, and BYU all feel very likely to do so. So to me, those are the top 9. Again, I already said I had TCU on an island, or almost had them on an island, because they're the only team really outside of that top 9 that I think has a chance to do it. Jamie Dixon's a very good coach. I could see it happening if they pick off a few teams in the Big 12, but I'm not quite there with them yet.
Yeah.
So yeah. I have those top 9. I don't have anybody else. So for me, they're going to be just short of getting double-digit teams in the Big Dance.
Well, let me join you in boring land, because I'm going to have to echo what you said. I think it's 9, and I think it's those top 2 tiers. I struggle getting other teams there as I look at either their roster or their situation and things like that. And not that it can't happen and it won't, but you look at an SEC, like you got to also think outside the Big 12. Like I think SEC is going to get a crap ton of teams as well. And so that starts to chip away. And then at some point, losses just start piling up, which is part of the reality of our bloated conferences. And so all of that is a factor. I got 9 teams, the same 9 as you.
All right, Isaac, that's going to wrap it up for our conference preview series this year. It means college basketball is back. I'm always a little sad. I love the conference previews. I love the team previews. I think we got a couple more of those coming. But the fact that we're done with them means that we're going to be starting to talk about real college basketball games very soon. I'm sure next week we'll talk about some of the fake games that are happening this weekend, some more charity exhibitions, some fun stuff that we'll get to see over this weekend. But then after next weekend, Monday night, we got Gonzaga Baylor, one of the big games of that first day. Texas and Ohio State playing as well on November 4th. Going to be so much fun to get real college basketball back. I cannot wait. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Don't forget to join our Discord channel, Locked On College Basketball, if you have not done so yet. It's free to join. Link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. As always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. Got a pair of those in the Big 12 in Arizona and Kansas State. And until Monday, peace.